my name's Durrant, and I work as a Hempcrete contractor and consultant, and I spend most of my time on site actually installing Hempcrete into buildings. But I also do a lot of consultancy work, and I sell the French spray machines. Wow, Hempcrete is such a good idea to build with for a whole host of reasons. I would say the most important ones are that it's carbon negative, so every cubic metre of Hempcrete we put into a building, it locks up approximately 110 kilos of carbon. So instead of emitting carbon, which most materials do during the building phase, Hempcrete is actually absorbing carbon. Then as the lime sets, it absorbs yet more carbon. So from a climate change point of view, it's a very good idea. It provides a breathable building, so we have no problems with moulds. The relative humidity in the building is always in the comfort zone. So and it insulates well as well. So you have a material that insulates and is breathable, environmentally friendly, and also perhaps one of its qualities that's often overlooked is that it has thermal mass. Although it's a lightweight material, it has thermal mass, and because it has thermal mass, it holds on to temperature. And it's an unusual material with thermal mass in that it heats up quickly but cools down slowly. Most materials that cool down slowly heat up slowly, but you have the advantage. So if you have a summer house and you arrive and the house is cold, it will heat up very quickly, and then once it's warm, it'll stay warm for a long time. So they are the main benefits, but there are a whole host of smaller benefits: quality of air, ease of build. There's all kinds of extra advantages to building with Hempcrete. In fact, in 30 years of designing and building things, it is without doubt the best material I've come across. There's no other building material that I know of that you can start. When we spray, people always ask how many layers you put it on in layers, and we don't layer it on, we put it on in one go. So even if we're doing a wall 450 millimeters thick, it goes on in one layer, we spray onto the backing board and bring it out to the surface, and we carry on going up. And I can go up 2 meters high in one day, and I can come back the next day and put another 2 meters on top of that. So it's quite unique in its ability to hold itself. There's no other building material that we ever use where we build a wall in that way. I think in terms of its environmental credentials and its breathability, and its ability to hold on to heat, I think it's a pretty unique building material in that sense. There are other building materials that have some of those qualities, but I've not worked with any, I've not come across any that have all the same qualities. And skill level, I guess, for learning how to use it, you can teach somebody to run the mixer in a morning. So one of your team can be trained that morning. To learn to spray really well probably takes about 6 weeks of using the sprayer. So there's a skill aspect. Most of the work is knowledge based, but there's a skill in using the actual spray nozzle properly. And then after that, it takes a good few years to learn when to use it, when not to use it, how to use it, the logistics of using it. That's where you need somebody with more experience on site. But essentially, there's no one element that is really complicated. It's working the logistics of the whole thing. Then it's complicated, but we build such good buildings. It's worth learning. I think that Hempcrete is an incredibly robust material, and I think that we can get it to work just as well in the Finnish climate as we can elsewhere. the trick is all in the detailing. If you get the detailing of the building right, there's no reason why the qualities that Hempcrete have can't be used almost everywhere. There will be limits, but what we don't know yet, the unknown quality, is how breathable materials cope when we're in the -20 kind of temperatures. And what we know is that it's about how long those temperatures persist for. So Hempcrete would cope very well with -20 for a short period. But what we need to find out is that there will be a limit to how much it can cope with. And that's probably one of the first pieces of research that we need to try and find out exactly where it can go. But of course, even once we know that, we can also know from our experience of building with Hempcrete, it will depend on the individual building and the individual detailing, getting that right. But those things we already know a lot about, so we can play with those details to get the best out of the building. In its most basic form, a pan mixer, you really need a pan mixer rather than a drum mixer. But the problem with hand casting alone without spraying is that you're very limited as to what buildings you can work on. So a lot of my work in the UK is on renovation of buildings, and I can do that renovation because I can spray the Hempcrete on. If you have a pan mixer, you can do new builds up to a point, but the labour involved is much greater. So the bare minimum is a pan mixer. The sprayer gives a whole nother level of possibilities. You can work with fewer people, you can get the job done quicker. And so really the spray machine commercially, I think pretty much most people that start out working with Hempcrete, they start out hand casting, but after a while they move over to wanting to buy a spray machine because they see the benefits. I take a team of 3 people around the country. If I were hand casting, I would need 6 people or 8 people to do the same amount of work. And of course there would be an implication to cost. And particularly when you're working at height, that's when another time when using that system works really well, because the problem with hand casting, once you get up, as you get higher and higher up the building, you're forced to be passing big buckets of Hempcrete up the building, whereas actually with the sprayer you're just standing there and just spraying into the space. It's all coming up the hoses. So you have one person on the mixer who keeps the hemp box topped up and keeps the binder topped up. So it takes 15 minutes to empty the agitator, but you can do a mix in about 4 minutes. So you have the reason for having the mixer and the agitator next to each other is you can provide a constant stream of binder. So in actual fact, on a good site where you have a new build, where you have thick walls, we can almost just pass the lance to each other. We can start the lance in the morning and we can virtually pass it to each other all day. There's no stopping to refill the mixer. It's a constant feed. So in terms of cubage and in terms of economics, we can get an awful lot of Hempcrete into the building in a day. I started out working for the Limecrete company 5 years ago. I came across Hempcrete first of all in France, thought it looked like a really interesting material, and then I did my master's degree in sustainable architecture, and decided after doing a lot of research on Hempcrete that it was, by then without doubt, such a good building material. And so I worked for the Limecrete company originally, and then 2.5 years ago I set up my own company, and I've been going from strength to strength ever since. It's a small company in that it's only me, and I subcontract in other people as I need them. but we do about 20, 25 houses a year, and I have nothing but a string of happy clients behind me. Oh wow, my first experiences of working with Hempcrete were pretty bad in many ways. I spent the first 3 years that I worked with Hempcrete, I used to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Monday morning at 4 o'clock, drive to the other end of the country with a bunch of guys that didn't really know what they were doing, put Hempcrete into buildings, and then arrive back home at 10 o'clock on a Friday night exhausted, having done 12 hours a day. So it was pretty tough in the beginning. There were a lot of mistakes made in the Hempcrete industry in the UK in the beginning, and the people that were supplying us with a lot of the information was flawed information. So there were a lot of problems. But actually, what we've managed to do over the last 5 years is move it on. And from my first experiences of watching people do what they were doing, we have come so far now, and I don't get any calls from clients saying, "Oh, come back, there's a problem." And in the beginning, I know before I ran the operations, I know there were a lot of clients calling after the job had been done. "Oh, there's a problem with this, there's a problem with that." But in every case, as soon as you looked at what had been done, you could realise why the problem existed. And we've come so far in that 5 years. How I'm doing the Hempcrete now, a job that would have taken me 6 weeks in the beginning, I'm doing those jobs in 3 weeks now. So we've moved a massive amount. So my early experiences it was a very steep learning curve, but now we're producing really good quality buildings with no headache really. Okay, the buildings, about 50% of my workload is renovation of old buildings, and 50% is new build. And so on the old buildings, it tends to be where we have very old timber frame buildings. A lot of my work is putting the new panels back. So if you imagine a timber frame building with a wattle and daub infill, which is essentially hazel wood with mud, for want of a better word. So when those panels are broken down and no longer any good, we take those panels out and we spray onto those. So there's a lot of my work is conservation of very old buildings. Then the next level is making buildings that were built sort of last century, making them better in terms of insulation. So sometimes I spray onto stonework, sometimes I spray onto brickwork. So there's that side of my work, and the other side of my work are complete new builds where we're building wall build-ups that are up to 450 millimeters thick. I don't spray any thicker than that because the drying times are a bit of a problem once you get thicker than that. And actually, once your wall is 450 millimeters thick, you really don't need to go any thicker than that. So I mainly spray to timber frames. We can use metal frames, but I think there's more complications using just metal frames. So I tend to stick with timber. And also, of course, the embodied energy in timber is much, much better for the planet than working with steel. So I can build houses. One of the beauties of the material is we're not stuck to straight lines. If I'm working on an old building and the facade of the old building has lumps and bumps in, I can replace all those lumps and bumps and make it look like the original. If somebody wants to do a modern building with a curved wall, I can do curved walls. Essentially, I can make all kinds of shapes because so there's a freedom with this material that's amazing to build almost whatever you can imagine shape-wise. We can build it in Hempcrete. There are some limitations, but essentially we have a great freedom with the material. So yeah, I guess new builds, they tend to be with a wall that's 450 mil thick. We're almost up to passive house standards. Certainly the performance that you'll get would be along those lines. And then on the other end of the scale, I might be working on a renovation where I'm just applying 100 millimetres onto a stone wall, normally on the inside, because planning regulations in the UK mean that we can't normally cover up stonework on the outside. So if we put 100 millimetres of Hempcrete on the inside of the building, it will bring all those advantages to what is essentially an old cold stone building, will suddenly become a much better place to live in. I think the advice with Hempcrete, working with the Hempcrete, actually having some experience of working with it with somebody else that knows what they're doing, makes a massive difference to the overall outcome. When lime technology in the UK started and they brought Hempcrete to the UK, in the end they stopped working with Hempcrete, and I had to ask myself, why do I think I could make Hempcrete work when they hadn't made Hempcrete work? And the answer to that question is that lime technology were the shopkeepers, if you like. They were selling the Hempcrete, they were selling the hemp, and they were selling the binder. And they were selling it to people that didn't know how to install it. So every job brought about different problems. Different people had different problems with the material. Now, I deal in Hempcrete, but I'm an installer, so I control the installation process. And the most important thing to get successful buildings with Hempcrete is to work with an installer that knows how to do it. It's all very well being able to sell the product, but if you're just selling the product to other people, I think that you will end up in the same way that lime technology did, with a lot of problems. Whereas if you actually sell the installation process, you can control the installation process. And if you control that process, you'll just have good buildings. And that's the difference. So I would say, in actual fact, I have people from all over the world come and work with me. They come and work with me for a few weeks, and even just for a few weeks, it makes such a difference, because they see the actual material going in. You get a sense of the material after a few weeks. So to me, it's all about the installation, regardless of what binder and what hemp and the other things. It's the installation process. If you control that, that's the key to doing good buildings. And so the way we work now, with a lot of, now I've nothing but successful buildings behind me. So for me, if somebody really wants to do Hempcrete, I think coming to work with me or somebody like me is the way forward to get that installation process right. Well, there's a difficult question. I think for me, every Hempcrete building that I do in the UK is another good advert for the next Hempcrete building. I've got clients that come back to me now for their second Hempcrete house. And I think the thing is, you need somebody brave enough to start, to put those buildings up, and then have people go in and spend some time in those buildings. I know Professor Tom Woolley in Northern Ireland was one of the first people that built a Hempcrete building in Northern Ireland, and he rents that cottage out. And he says, people come along, they stay in the cottage for a week, and they don't want to leave. Because Hempcrete modifies the relative humidity and deals with temperature so well, you get an air quality that is excellent, and a comfort quality. Now, each of the buildings that I build give that. And so building a few buildings for those people brave enough to give it a try is a very good advert, and I think that maybe that's the best advert for Hempcrete, is for somebody to go and spend time in a Hempcrete house. Most of my clients, particularly on the new builds, will tell you that they wouldn't go back to living in an ordinary house now that they've lived in a Hempcrete house, because you get used to that comfort and that quality. And actually, when you go back into a normal house, there is a difference. And I think that the best way of getting it known anywhere is to build some. Failing that, I guess getting architects on board, because I have a client who will give me one job. If I get an architect on board with me, they'll feed me 3-4 jobs a year. So I think it's getting architects on board, getting other tradesmen on board. I've got timber framers that they've repaired an old timber frame or an old building, and then they recommend me, and I go in, and I've got timber framers that I've done lots of jobs for over the years, because once they realise, well, hold on, I do timber framing, I put my frame up, Graham will come along and spray it, we know that works. And so I think getting architects and tradesmen on board with the idea is the quickest way of expanding it. But it's about being, I guess it's with all these new things that are good, it's about being brave enough to try them.